Thanks, Alex, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this very intriguing symposium. Okay, so here we go. So as you've heard, the global signal contains contributions from many different processes: motion, physiological noise, scanner noise. But we also think that there's interesting information in there because you can have global changes in brain activity, or what we might consider more widespread changes in brain activity that are at the network level rather than at the global level. Better? Okay. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to ignore those first three parts. We're going to just talk about the parts of the global signal that have some sort of interest in terms of neuronal information. And just as kind of a caveat, I'm using global signal here very loosely. It can be anything from the mean gray matter signal to the whole brain signal. Occasionally, we even see very similar things with white matter and CSF signals. Okay, so the main thing I'm interested in here is whether the global signal reflects changes in baseline activity throughout the whole brain, or whether it's localized to particular aspects, let's say network structure. So if you look over on this side, I've got two matrices that have an average of, say, 5. I could have a change in baseline, where all of the voxels kind of get some signal added to them, and now the average overall is 7. So that would be a change in the global signal. Or you can imagine that I can take a small subset of those voxels and put in a higher change and get the same overall average. So it makes sense, right? So what I'm interested here is which of those cases we're really looking at if we look at the neural information in the global signal. So we know there is information in the global signal. One of the earliest studies to show this came from Scholvink et al. They were doing simultaneous microelectrode recording and MRI in the monkey, and they saw that changes in gamma power were linked to kind of this very widespread increase in brain signal at approximately the hemodynamic delay. So that right there suggests that there's something in the global signal that carries neural information. Now, I have another plot at the bottom that's preliminary data from my own lab, and what we're showing there is we've got data from a rat where we've implanted 6 different electrodes around the brain, not linked to any specific network, but kind of spread out. And we looked at the electrical coherence across all frequencies in those electrodes. And you can see that there's pretty high coherence in the frequencies, especially below about 10 hertz. So again, something that suggests there might be this sort of global neural signal that we want to pick up on. So I'm going to score that as +1 for baseline change, 0 for network-based change. So one of the other groups that's been studying global signal a lot is Tom Liu's group, with this paper by Wang et al. Being an excellent example. They're looking at how global signal relates to EEG measures of vigilance. And for example, if you look before and after a dose of caffeine, the change in levels of vigilance matches really nicely with changes in global signal amplitude. And there's been a lot more work since this. It kind of builds on this idea. So I'm showing one of the examples here, and if you look at the changes, pre-dose versus post-dose in the two groups with low and high levels of global signal, you can see that the changes are more confined to the network. Similarly, there's been some recent work, say the paper by Turchi et al. That says global signal is linked to the basal forebrain, and I'm counting this as a network change. So in this case, we might be seeing changes in kind of this network where certain areas activate highly, other areas don't change that much. So I've got 1 for baseline, 1 for network right now. Okay, so this is one of my favorite recent studies about global signal. This is from Garth Thompson from Famid Hyder's lab when he was a postdoc there. And he looked at global signal with FDG PET. And so if you look at the eyes closed situation versus eyes open with PET, you get a baseline shift in global metabolism. That baseline shift in metabolism also correlated really nicely with a change in global signal. However, it did not change variance-based measures, which suggests that the main effect on the fMRI is this change in the baseline global signal that we see. Now, that said, if you look at panel C, where there's a difference between A and B, the eyes open and closed conditions, you do see localization to a network. So I'm going to count this as evidence for both a baseline change and a network-based change. So I'm up to 2 and 2. So I think this is my other main piece of evidence to look at here. One of the things we've done in my lab is to look at global signal regression in the context of simultaneous microelectrode recording in fMRI. So in this case, we have electrodes implanted in left and right S1 in the rat, and we've recorded LFP power along with fMRI. We've used sliding window correlation to map the changes in band-limited power coordination across the two sites as a function of time. And we've looked at how that sliding window correlation of LFP power is related to sliding window correlation of bold power. Because those of you who know me know that I'm very interested in brain dynamics in general, and this was something that we were trying to figure out. But as a side effect, what we found is that if we looked at the relationship between bold and LFP with global signal regression, which is shown over on this side, we got a better representation of the LFP information in the bold data than if we did no global signal regression. So global signal regression actually improves our sensitivity to these underlying neural changes. So I'm going to count that as another one for a baseline change, not network. So I think to date, it's been, so far we're kind of tied, right? It's about 3 to 2. It's pretty balanced. So I want to do a case study and look at a particular type of large-scale network activity. And the one I'm going to talk about are these quasi-periodic patterns. This is something that we've been interested in a long time in my group. It's the idea that you have repeated spatiotemporal patterns going on in the background of resting state scans. So this is volume over time. It usually lasts about 20 seconds in humans. And what we get out is this template, this volume over time, and then a time course that tells us how strong it is at any point in the scan. So this is what it looks like. Oh, good, my movie's playing today. You'll see alternating activity in the default mode network and the task-positive network, and there's a very stereotyped switching between these two networks. Now, this was made from about 820 subjects of the HCP data set, and the details of pre-processing and everything can be found in the paper by Benaz Yousefi. If you look at subcortical areas, you'll see that they match very nicely with the cortical areas that they're most connected to. So the reason that I thought this would be a good test case to look at in terms of global signal is because these patterns account for a lot of the functional connectivity that we see. So they're very strong. So if anything's going to contribute to global signal, this should be it. If you look at the original connectivity up here, you can see that after we regress out the QPPs, much of it goes away. So this should have some relationship to global signal. So the question is, can we disentangle them? And I think one piece of evidence that they really are linked is that both are linked to arousal. So I mentioned the Turchi paper earlier about global signal and the basal nucleus of minor, one of these subcortical nuclei that can be involved in arousal. The QPPs have been linked to locus coeruleus activity. They change in anesthesia. They predict performance on a vigilance task. So it seems likely that these might share some sort of common information. So the first thing we did was very simple. Again, this was in HCP data. We just took the global signal, and we did correlation between global signal after different types of processing and the signal from every other voxel in the brain. And what we were looking for was either a pattern that matched really well to one part of the QPP or to lagged correlation. If we lagged the global signal relative to the bold signal, we would see different patterns over time, like we see in the QPP. We didn't see any evidence of that. So it really looked more like just a baseline change. Although you'll note there is some spatial specificity, it's not really confined to a single network. So then we went back to the HCP data where we were doing our QPP analysis, and we looked at it on a single subject basis, depending on how much global signal there was. So here we have our subjects sorted by how many areas were closely correlated to LPPC, and so they had very high correlation. And over here they're sorted by how many were this is a high anti-correlation. These were the ones that were most anti-correlated with LPPC, and these are the ones that were most correlated. So the ones that have lots of general correlation tend to have high global signal. And when we did the analysis separately on these two groups, we got the patterns down at the bottom, where you can see the same spatial pattern. You kind of lose the anti-correlation. It's more like a baseline shift, though. So the pattern itself remains the same. And if we then do global signal regression and do the same analysis, it makes our QPPs all look like the QPPs in the anti-correlated group before, where we see the strong change between positive and negative correlation over the course of the cycle. And if we then look at these values for how many areas are correlated versus anti-correlated, we get a much flatter distribution across all subjects. So we're interpreting that as evidence, again, that the global signal in this case acts as a baseline shift rather than something that's network specific. So another question you can ask is, are these patterns a trait, something that's more similar in one person across time, or are they a state that reflects more the current state of the individual, whether you've had caffeine, whether you're jet lagged, how early in the morning it is, all of these sorts of things. So we looked at the HCP data from day 1 and day 2, and for global signal, the plot is shown over here. We had a very high correlation. Global signal was tightly correlated across days. And we did the same thing for some metrics from QPP. The one I'm showing is the sum of the correlation at the maximum points, and that's basically a surrogate for how strong and how frequent the QPP patterns are. So again, it's correlated across days, but not as strongly as the global signal is. We also looked at the correlation of the spatial and temporal pattern of the QPP itself across days and found that it was more similar, again, within people rather than across people. So it seems like both global signal and these QPPs are more trait-like than state-like. But because the correlation between day 1 and day 2 is higher for global signal, I don't think that the similarity of the global signal is being driven by similarity of QPPs. So again, I'm going to put that in the column for a baseline shift. We also did a quick examination of QPPs versus head motion. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail since we already heard a bunch about motion earlier, but our conclusions were the same as what Jonathan brought up, which is that head motion is correlated with global signal, but not necessarily a proxy for it. So we got the same results, basically. Okay, so that's one aspect. We've talked about, are these QPPs contributing to global signal? The other question we can ask is, does the global signal somehow co-occur with the QPPs? So we've looked at this in a couple of different settings here, and the one I'm showing is some mouse data from Michael Beloy. And what he found is that he had a pattern of QPP, and he also did kind of the same analysis but triggered on peaks of the global signal. And what he saw is that the patterns were not the same, but there was some sort of phase locking between those patterns. So that would suggest that maybe something about the QPP is somehow contributing to this global signal. For example, if you look here, this is the QPP up here. This is the global signal down in the bottom row. And you might say, well, there's this strong positive increase in signal in the middle that kind of lines up with this decrease down here. What does that mean? Well, maybe it's these negative decreases that we see on the side that are really contributing to that. Honestly, I don't have an explanation yet. But I do think it's intriguing that kind of these two patterns are phase locked in some manner. So I'm going to count that as one for a network-based change. So just to summarize, I think overall it looks like the global signal, if you're talking about the neural part, is more weighted to some sort of baseline fluctuation than it is to network-based changes. So that is kind of exciting because it suggests there might be two separate processes that we can pull out. We know that QPPs can contribute to global signal because they can be phase locked. We've shown in some of our other work that the QPPs are present even when global signal levels are very low. so it doesn't go the other direction. We think these can be separable, and they each carry individual specific information. So I guess to come back to the question is, which is responsible to the ties to arousal? I don't think we really know yet, but I want to show one last study, and this is recent work from Fallapur et al. That shows that an arousal template, which is very similar to one phase of the QPP, is a better predictor of EEG-based vigilance than the global signal is. So that suggests to me that the sensitivity to vigilance in the global signal is actually coming from the sensitivity in these templates and QPPs, that somehow global signal is picking up some of that. Now, whether that's direct or whether it's mediated by changes in respiration, like Jonathan talked about earlier, I think is going to be something we need to do further work to try to disentangle. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. If you're interested in this, there's more on Banaz's poster today, 648. And also I wanted to put up some resources for women in neuroscience and to point out that if you have kids here, there's a family meeting bulletin board on the OHBM meeting page. So please check that out. Feel free to share tips. Thank you.